to do something, I'm really way better off if I do that. But let me talk a little bit about her background, because I think it's a key to understanding the talk she's going to give and the book she's written. She's from eastern Idaho, and growing up in a place like that, she developed a very deep interest in and knowledge of a diverse array of cultures. Most people aren't aware of Idaho's history, but it's a history that wraps up Native Americans, Mexican-American workers, all kinds of different ethnic groups that have come to Idaho to labor, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and so forth. It's a very diverse place. Amanda is very familiar with rural life and culture, agriculture. She has ties to Pocatello, and all of these experiences in her family background have informed her work. She went to the College of Idaho, where she met her husband, Jordan Komoto. She was a star student at that institution. She went on to the University of Michigan for a PhD before coming to MSU in 2015. Something that you ought to know about her is her impressive intellect. There are few scholars I know who can cover such a range of topics. She told me the other day that in the time she's been at MSU, she has taught 19 different courses. And that's a lot. Most of us, by the time we get to coming up for tenure and promotion, have taught 3 or 4, something like that. Amanda has taught 19. I mean, her expertise ranges through American history, British history, the history of empire and colonialism, Native American history, gender and sexuality history, family history, the list goes on. So that makes her, a really wonderful person to be around, because she's got such a lively mind. Her book, this background and her wide-ranging intellect and all that breadth inform her book, Imperial Zions, Religion, Race, and Family in the American West and the Pacific, which was just published last year, copies of which are for sale by Extreme History, and I highly recommend that book. It's from the standpoint of the history of the American West, which is one of my specialties. It's a book that's about Western American history, but it's about so much more than just that. It's very different from the kinds of books that were being written by young scholars, myself included, when I was her age. So my first book was about Idaho agriculture. But Amanda's book goes way, way, way beyond that. She looks at the relationship of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, to Native American people, to Native Hawaiian people, in the age of U.S. expansion and empire going on out into the Pacific. That's incredible breadth. And it's an impressive book by an impressive scholar, and she's going to tell you more about that now. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Amanda Hendrix-Komoto to the lecture series.
Well, I'll just go with the podium view, because when I unmute the podium, it immediately squeals, so I want to mute it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I won't use this one. I'm good. I can talk loud anyway, and there's not that many people here, so.
Can everyone hear Amanda? Maybe Peter can help.
We're good. I'll be fine. I have a loud voice anyway. I probably actually don't need a microphone. Well, thank you, Mark, for that really lovely introduction. I'd also like to thank the Extreme History Project and the Ivan Joy Center for inviting me to speak today. Mark has already given you a little bit of history about me. A lot of scholars, when they start talking, and when it's about a Native project, will start by giving a land acknowledgement. But those have become somewhat controversial because land acknowledgements are often given without any action and without any sort of real reflection in the work itself to situate yourself in relationship to the area's indigenous history, to settler colonialism, and to the removal of indigenous peoples from the area. And so rather than start with a traditional land acknowledgement, I wanted to start today by doing some of the work that Mark has already done and to situate myself in relationship to this topic. So Mark has covered some of this. I will quickly move us forward. I don't know actually how. I don't remember having it do these piece by piece. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am and about my own history in relationship to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, often called the Mormons. So I am a scholar of sexuality, religion, and then American understandings of race. As Mark said, I'm originally from southeastern Idaho. I was born in Pocatello and raised in Blackfoot, Idaho, which is about a half hour away. And if you know the geography of southeastern Idaho, what that means is that I was born on one side of the Fort Hall Indian Reservation and then went to school and was raised on the other side. And so my life is sort of surrounded the Fort Hall Indian Reservation. I do have some family connections, rather attenuated to Montana. The most important one probably for people in this room is my aunt, great aunt, married an African-American man, which was illegal at the time in Idaho. This was before Loving. And the nearest place where they could actually get married was Dillon, Montana. And so they drove from Pocatello to Dillon to get married. And so that is my family connection to Montana. It allowed my great aunt to get married in a time when she otherwise wouldn't have been able to do so. My family, my father's side, also has deep connections to the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This woman is Ada Winchell. She is my 5th great-grandmother. And she was born in upstate New York in 1801 and married a man named Albert Clements on January 28, 1820. And when she was in her 20s, a local man, or boy, named Joseph Smith, received a vision claiming to have found golden plates and unearthed them near Palmyra, New York. Stories of his discovery soon circulated around the upstate New York region, and in 1830 he founded his own church formally. Ada's husband Albert came home one day with a copy of the Book of Mormon. He had heard about the church from a Mormon missionary, Latter-day Saint missionary, named Sidney Rigdon. And Ada and her husband were quite taken with the Book of Mormon, converted to the church, and then ended up following the church from, and I'll show you a map real quick, from upstate New York. So the blue is sort of the area that she was from. They went to Kirtland, Ohio. They then followed, in the green is Zion's Camp. And then they ended up going up to Nauvoo, and then they followed the Saints west to Utah on the Purple Trail. And so my family history has been really entwined with sort of this movement from New York all the way to Utah, and then Ada, some of her family ends up going to what's now Idaho Falls. It used to be a bunch of little communities around Idaho Falls, known as Eagle Rock at the time. And my book follows the Saints not only as sort of they move along this trail, but also at the same time as they're doing missionary work in places like Tahiti, Hawaii, Utah, Great Britain, Canada. One thing that I like to tell people is that the Latter-day Saints were actually in Tahiti before they were in Utah. And so from the very beginning, they have been doing missionary work that expands quite broadly. I have, of course, other family members who have been members of the church, and their lives have really sort of informed the way that I see church history. So this is one of Ada's daughters. Her name is Eliza Clemens. Her husband married her, and then a couple of years later, he married her sister in 1853. Eliza and her sister Elizabeth, which does get a little bit confusing because those names are very close together, but I check every time. I am descended from Eliza, and I can never remember which sister it is, but Eliza ends up sort of developing a really tense relationship with her sister.
leaves her husband and then moves to Idaho. And there's actually a Salt Lake City Tribune article about her experiences. According to the Tribune, she brooded over her troubles until her mind became unbalanced, and she was placed in an insane asylum in Blackfoot. I actually went to the middle school right across from that insane asylum, where she was kept until a cure was effected, after which she married again to a different man. And then she was actually released from the insane asylum, now called a mental hospital, in order to go to the commemoration in Utah of the arrival of the Latter-day Saints in the Great Basin. And so she desperately wanted, they were going to take a picture of all of the people who sort of walked to Utah before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Saints had originally arrived in Utah in 1847, so 50 years later they're going to take a picture. We know she was released because she actually appears in this photograph, which is of all the pioneers they could get together in 1897, of the people who had walked across. And you'll notice I have circled her here in yellow. And so these are sort of my family history, or the way that I think of my family history really focuses on the experiences of women. And I've tried to foreground the experiences of women within my book. But Latter-day Saint history, I think, is more than just the history of sort of these white Latter-day Saints who walked across the plains. Because of the significant missionary work that they did, there's also a Native history of the church, and a Polynesian history of the church, and a Black history of the church. And I think those are just as important as sort of this white history that we often tell of the Latter-day Saints, that begins in upstate New York, as I did today, and then ends in Utah. And you can see that as well. Oh, actually, real quick before I move on, this is the last member of my family to grow up in polygamy. Does anybody want to take a guess what day she died, or what year she died? 1993. Wow. So it is a much closer history than we often like to think of. And here she is holding my grandmother. So my grandma is the baby there in the middle. And this is the same woman that you saw as a younger woman here. And so this history is really present, I think, in the lives of people in Idaho and Utah, and shapes the way that they interact with the places in which they grow up and live. But as I was saying earlier, you can even see you see the Native history of the church in really interesting ways in the individual family histories of Latter-day Saints. I could not find a picture of Marianne Barzee. This is their homestead, and I actually don't know, that could be her, we can pretend it's her in the picture, but this is the homestead in which she lived, and she had married one of Ada Winchell's children, and they moved to Utah, lived in Springville, which is near Provo. And she adopted, and we should put that in quotation marks, a Native child. The story sort of goes, and we have no way to know this is true, that there was a local Native man, she doesn't say what community he's from, or give him really an identity, who had approached her because he knew she was nursing. And he asked her to nurse his child because the mother had just died. And according to the family history, Ada agrees. They claim that she nursed sort of both children at her breast at the same time. And then the child ends up passing away at 2. When I first heard this story, I thought it was probably a made-up story. There's lots of made-up stories in family histories. But if you visit the Springville Pioneer Cemetery, there's a tombstone for the child, which suggests that there's probably something more there than just sort of family lore. That this may have actually been a child that she had nursed and then who had passed away. So all of these things together have sort of shaped the way that I see history. I see history as a collection of stories that we bring together and we interpret. And one of the things that I emphasize is that the stories that individual historians tell are only one version of what's happened. They're only one story that we tell. And in individual family histories also contain multiple stories. I could today tell you a history of Ada Clements, and I just gave you a very short one. You could also tell that same story from the position of Marianne Barzee. You could tell it from the position of the Native man who had given up his child to be nursed by Marianne. You can tell Mormon history from a Black perspective. You can tell it from a Tahitian perspective. And the story that you tell looks really different. And today what I want to do is tell sort of a history of the Latter-day Saints from the perspective of Native people who were either brought into white Mormon families, which happen quite frequently, or who ended up converting to the church. And so in order to do that, we are going to start with actually the Book of Mormon, because the Book of Mormon shapes the way that early Latter-day Saints interact with Native people. So to give you a very brief background of the Book of Mormon, in 1820, Joseph Smith receives a vision, and we have different accounts of this vision, but he receives a vision of the angel Moroni, maybe Jesus Christ himself, depending on which version you're reading, and he reveals to him that an ancient record recording God's dealings with the Americas has been buried in the nearby hill Cumorah. He uncovers this record, and this record eventually becomes the Book of Mormon. And scholars have argued that this book is essentially a family history. It starts out with one man who has some children, and they escape the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem itself in around 600 BCE. And then they end up traveling to the Americas. And while they're in the Americas, these brothers end up founding impressive civilizations, according to the Book of Mormon. Two of the brothers, however, reject the gospel, and God ends up cursing and darkening their skin. And the language within the Book of Mormon is that sort of a darkness falls upon them. And there's been some debate in the 20th century about whether that should be interpreted as skin color. But in the 19th century, almost every Latter-day Saint interprets that as meaning that these people have their skin physically darkened, and then that these people become the ancestors of Native Americans. And so this book is seen as a history of Native Americans, and many Latter-day Saints in the 19th century believe that in the end times, the Native Americans that are living around Missouri, New York, Ohio, are going to be restored to their position as Israelites and are going to become a part of the kingdom of God again. And a lot of early Latter-day Saint missionary work is focused on Native people for that reason. And I should say, modern Latter-day Saints don't tend to have those same beliefs. These are 19th century Latter-day Saint beliefs for the most part. Really quick, here's the verse from the Book of Mormon that talks about their skin being darkened. So it comes from 2 Nephi 5:21. And he had caused the cursing to come upon them. I actually never know how to pronounce this word. Even a sore cursing because of their iniquity. For behold, they had hardened their hearts against him, that they had become like unto a flint. Wherefore, as they were white and exceedingly fair and delightsome, that they might not be enticing unto my people, the Lord God did cause a skin of blackness to come upon them. And one of the things that I would draw your attention to is that the reason for sort of the darkening of the skin in this particular verse is attributed to a need or desire to make them not enticing, not desirable for the people who are still following God and still have light skin. There are things you can do with this passage to change its interpretation, but in the 19th century, there's definitely the sense that to have your skin darkened makes you less sexually desirable. Here is a painting from 1844 of Joseph Smith preaching to some indigenous people. This is probably the Delaware Nation in this picture. One thing I do want to point out is that this is using stereotypes of Native Americans. By the 1840s, a lot of the Native people who are living around early Latter-day Saint settlements are dressing in fairly European clothing. And so it's unlikely that they actually would have looked like this. But this is a sort of an imagined moment in which Joseph Smith is preaching directly to Native Americans in an attempt to bring them into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Latter-day Saints in this time period, many of them become quite interested in the conversion of Native Americans. And there's actually stories of early Latter-day Saints, particularly in Missouri, pretending and imitating Native Americans in their religious practice. So one of the stories that comes to us is that Parley P. Pratt, who's an early Latter-day Saint missionary, along with some other men, are traveling to a group of Native Americans who have been removed by Andrew Jackson's removal policies. And as they're sort of traveling to them, they come across a white Latter-day Saint settlement, and they notice what he calls strange spiritual operations among this sort of group of people. And according to Parley P. Pratt, these people stand around a river, they speak in pretended Indian tongues, they do something they call scooting on the ground to the Lamanites, which involves them sort of dropping to the floor and then moving towards Native people, and then they also engage in sort of imagined scalpings. And these people are pretty quickly reprimanded by the larger church, but what their experiences tell us is that it shows us the ways in which these people become focused on Native Americans, and the ways in which some of Latter-day Saints, not all, are very sort of focused on the redemption of Native peoples. The other thing that begins to circulate fairly early on in Latter-day Saint communities is rumors that Joseph Smith is encouraging intermarriage between white Latter-day Saints and Native people in an attempt to bring them into the church. And we get evidence sort of these rumors from two sources. One is from an anti-Mormon newspaper that's published in Missouri. The other is from a reminiscence that comes in 1861 from a man named W.W. Phelps. He's a hymn writer and a fairly influential Latter-day Saint. And he says, quote, "It is my will that in time you should take unto you the wives of Lamanites and Nephites," which is what early Latter-day Saints are calling Native Americans, "that their prosperity may become white, delightsome and just, for even now their females are more virtuous than the Gentiles," end quote. And Gentiles is referring to non-Mormons there. And so W.W. Phelps is talking about what Joseph Smith had told him, or at least what he remembers Joseph Smith telling him. And if you take that evidence along with the anti-Mormon newspapers, it tells you that at least stories are circulating about possible interracial marriages between white Latter-day Saints and Native Americans. After Joseph Smith's death, the Latter-day Saints end up leaving their community in a mass exodus and traveling across the plains to Utah. Once they get to Utah, they're in an interesting space because for the first time, they are among a significant Native population. There had always been pockets of Native Americans in the American East, but most of those people are being removed. In Utah, Latter-day Saints see them as being in, quote, Indian country. And they are going to focus much more than they had earlier on the possibility of redeeming the Lamanites, or to put it in sort of more modern terms, converting Native Americans. And one of the ways in which they do so is by adopting Native American children into their homes, and then eventually there's a limited effort to marry Native women. When the Latter-day Saints arrive in Utah, there's actually a pre-existing slave trade of Native women and children. As a result of Spanish colonization, some of the mounted Native American communities, the Comanche, the Ute, have been raiding local other Native American communities and then selling them to the Spanish and then to some other Native communities. The Latter-day Saints, when they come in, actually start buying some of these children from the Ute slave traders, and then they sometimes consider them children, they sometimes consider them to be indentured labor, and sometimes they use them in a way that's akin to slave labor. So there's a wide variety of ways in which these children and women are being treated. And then the other ways in which they end up bringing Native children into their homes is sometimes after a massacre or a community is experiencing poverty, they'll have families basically come up to them and say, "I have no way to care for this child, please do something." And then a Native or a white family might take a child that way. Or there are stories of Native children standing among the dead after a massacre, being taken by white Latter-day Saints and then sold to white families. And what I want to do for the rest of my talk is to talk a little bit about the experiences of some of these children. So the first person I want to talk about, and I don't have pictures of most of them, is a man named Dave Monson. Dave Monson we don't know much about where he sort of comes from, but he ends up in a white Mormon family. He was adopted as a child by this family. We know that he's Paiute. And in 1887, he marries a woman named Laura Jensen, and she is the daughter of a Danish convert. One of the difficulties that sort of Indian children who had been adopted into white families had is there's a fair amount of uncertainty about what their lives are going to look like as adults. When they're children, they can be used as indentured labor, they can be treated as children, but when they grow up, the white Mormon community is still reticent about allowing interracial marriage and encouraging it. There are some people who think that it's a very good idea, that it's going to speed the process of conversion. There are other people who are concerned that if you allow Native children to marry white people, that is going to somehow taint or corrupt the community. So in 1887, Dave Monson marries a white woman named Laura Jensen. He ends up working an odd variety of jobs to make ends meet. He shears sheep, he butchers animals, he works as a teamster. They end up living in a one-room house in Spring City, Utah. And according to his daughter Edith, they struggle to do more than, quote, live hand to mouth, end quote. Laura doesn't extensively write about why she married Monson. Her early marriage, however, seems to have been relatively happy. Her daughter Edith describes her father as, quote, a gentleman who was fun-loving and liked to attend the occasional picnic and dance, end quote. In 1912, however, Monson abandons his family to shear sheep in Wyoming. When he dies in 1925, the local Sarasota Springs newspaper reported that there was, quote, common talk, end quote, that he had, quote, several sons and daughters in Utah, end quote. And so he ends up sort of being able to marry into this family, but for whatever reason, it's difficult for him. And he ends up just sort of abandoning his family to live elsewhere. The difficulty of finding someone who was willing to marry you comes up again in the case of a woman named Susie Pulsifer. The historian Michael K. Benyon has told, or has sort of recounted her tale. And if you know sort of the history or know a lot of Mormon scholars, the other person who's written about her is Juanita Brooks, who's a scholar from southern Utah. And she really struggled to find her place within the Latter-day Saint community. A mixed race, so a white woman and a Native woman and a white man had adopted Susie Pulsifer when she was a young girl. She later lived in St. George, Utah. She actually ends up giving birth to a series of illegitimate children. And what's interesting about her case is that she seems to have been somewhat accepted by the community. According to Benyon, she offered an impassioned defense of her morality when she was called before a local judge for having these illegitimate children. Quote, I have a right to children. No white man will marry me. I cannot live with the Indians, but I can have children, and I will support the children that I have, end quote. Later on, when Juanita Brooks is interviewing people in the community, she comes upon a girl, and the girl is talking about Susie Pulsifer and tells Brooks that, quote, if she was going to be an old maid, she would be a respectable old maid, like Susie, and have children, end quote. And so Susie, in spite of sort of the difficulties of her young life, seems to have maintained a somewhat sort of respectable sense within the community. When Latter-day Saints are bringing these children in, their hope is because they're not full adults, that they will be able to teach these children more easily to live like white men and women, to adopt white methods of agriculture, and then these children, because of their sort of physical similarity to Native Americans, will be more accepted as missionaries when they're sent out to local Native communities. However, they're never able to fully sort of reconcile the position of these individuals within their communities. And we can see that in the story of a man named John T. Garr. So Johnny's father, I'm gonna actually back up. John T. Garr is the father, the son is named Johnny. So I promise, call the father John T. Garr and then the son Johnny, because it gets really confusing with how many Johns there are in this particular family. So Johnny's father, John T. Gar, was born in 1827 in Indiana. His parents then converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1846 when John was 19 years old. The family then ends up joining the Saints as they're moving their way across the plains in a place called Winter Quarters, Nebraska. So the Saints aren't yet in Utah. The Gar family moves up to Nebraska and meets them sort of as they're on their way to Utah. After they arrive in Utah, they end up working on Antelope Island for a while. They're called to be cattle ranchers. And then Brigham Young, after a particularly harsh winter in the Salt Lake Valley, decides that he's going to seek out new pastures which will be good to graze cattle. And he settles on Logan, Utah as an area where they might be able to find good grass. And as many of you know, Logan, Utah is also quite frigid. Bozeman is usually a little bit colder than Logan, but it's also a harsh area, although it does have good grazing land. And so Johnny Gar goes with two of his brothers to the Cache Valley in the 1850s. He is living as a bachelor. Soon after his arrival, however, rumors began to spread about the, quote, intimacy, end quote, Gar shared with a Shoshone woman. Family history suggests that the woman may have been Susie Wajiji, a Shoshone woman originally from the Ruby Valley of Nevada, who eventually settled in northern Utah in a Shoshone Mormon town called Washakie. It was difficult for the first Latter-day Saint settlers in Logan, Utah, and around that surrounding area to keep secrets from each other. Before the arrival of white families, the men who lived in the valley promoted a rough homosociality in which they, quote, rode together, ate together, slept together, and associated generally together, as cowboys do, end quote. So eventually, Johnny ends up having a child John Tegar ends up having a child with Susie Wajiji, and she ends up calling him Johnny after his father. At some point, and we don't know the exact time, we know that Johnny is still a toddler, he comes to her, or she comes to him, and tells him that he needs to take this child because if he doesn't, then the local Shoshone community is going to kill the child. There's a couple possible things that are happening here. One, it could be a story that the local white community is telling that is meant to highlight the savagery of the Shoshone people. It's also possible that the Shoshone community it's a community that's undergoing a lot of stress in the time period. And there's a lot of hunger because of the ways in which the cattle are changing Shoshone foodways, making it impossible for them to gather or hunt or grow their own food in the ways that they had. And there are limited occasions in which we know that some Native communities, not necessarily the Shoshone, although this is a possibility that some people have suggested, where they would try to find alternative homes or something else to care for the children if they are undergoing severe stress in the time period. And the Shoshone community is definitely undergoing stress in this time period. A few years after Johnny is born, an event happens that has become known as the Bear River Massacre. On January 29th, 1863, a man named Patrick O'Connor leads a group of California volunteers against a Shoshone band that is camped on the Bear River. Within a couple of hours, there are at least a couple and possibly several hundred people dead. It's impossible to know exactly what happened because of the lack of sources, but a few soldiers did write about their experiences. According to Shoshone oral traditions, American soldiers shot women and children indiscriminately. People spoke frequently afterwards about a 15-year-old boy who had lain down in the mud with his grandmother in hopes that the soldiers would not find him among the dead. There's another story in which a woman is about to be discovered by the soldiers and she has a choice to make. She can either let the baby drown in the Bear's icy rivers. It was in the middle of January, and so it's mainly iced over, although it was probably flowing at this time of year. There are stories of the soldiers' fingers sort of freezing to their guns as they're shooting Shoshone. And so her choice is either to let her baby die because it's about to cry out, or to drown the baby. Or sorry, to both her and the baby to die when they get discovered by the soldiers, or for her to drown the baby. And the story that is told by the Shoshone is that she decided to let the baby drown so that she might live, rather than letting them both die. Local Latter-day Saints are not directly involved, but we do know that they cheered the massacre. The minutes of the Logan First Ward were chillingly explicit in their approval. We, the people of the Cache Valley, the document read, looked upon the movement of Colonel Connor as the intervention of the Almighty, as the Indians had been a source of great annoyance to us for a long time, end quote. For his part, Connor is promoted to general after the massacre. The Shoshone people, unable to bury their dead, actually end up pushing them into the Bear River because they're unable to bury them. There are children who are found in the massacre. This is an image of Frank Warner. He is a Shoshone Latter-day Saint. He was 2 years old when the massacre happened. He was found standing on the battlefield. The account said that he was sort of dazed and just staring blankly ahead. And he was so traumatized by what was happening around him that he just stood there holding a bowl of pine nut gravy. He never dropped it throughout the entire massacre, and not afterwards when people found him staying there. He is then, so his father finds him, he's purchased from his father and then given to a white family to raise, who then ends up giving him to one of their relatives. He grows up in Parker, Idaho, and then lives in Rexburg for a while, and then is actually a Native American Latter-day Saint missionary who's sent to Montana to try to convert Native people in Montana to the church. And so he ends up being a really interesting figure within Mormon history. So Johnny Gar ends up growing up in this community where this has happened. His mother's people have been massacred. He's been given to his white father to raise. And he grows up among a people who wrote in a minute book that they looked upon the death of his mother's people as the movement of God. So you can imagine his life is quite difficult. When he grows up, there's lots of stories of the difficulties that he encountered. He gets in a fight in a local Utah store because he thinks that the proprietor had called him a dog. The proprietor claims that he was talking about an actual dog. It's obviously difficult to suss that out, but he experienced a lot of racism in his childhood. When he grows up, he marries this woman here. Her name's Elizabeth Hulsa, and he marries her on December 31st, 1890. She quickly thereafter bears him 3 children, one of whom dies as an infant. Elizabeth then becomes pregnant with twins, and while she is pregnant with twins, Johnny dies in a wagon accident in a canyon. It tips over, and he ends up passing away. To provide for her children, she then moves into her father-in-law's house. She remembers their relationship as being quite close. After her husband's death, Elizabeth recalled that the elderly man told her to, quote, not worry or fret or be alarmed, end quote. One neighbor described Gar as a loving grandfather who remarked on how proud he was of his grandchildren and then kissed them when they ran up to him. Although individual family members may have objected to their union, Johnny's family tolerated Johnny and his marriage to Elizabeth and then the children that they had until 1900, when John T. Gar, Johnny's father, died. He dies without a will, and so his case is sent to the local probate court, which is how we sort of know about their history. Elizabeth sues for his estate, arguing that she is his heir because she'd been living in his house, she is the widow of his son, and she is the mother of his grandchildren. John T. Gar's siblings countersue, saying that Johnny was, number 1, illegitimate, number 2, that their brother was not the father, and that therefore the grandchildren, could not inherit the estate. And as a result, it ends up going to the Cache Valley Court, and then it actually eventually ends up at the Utah Supreme Court as they're trying to figure out who ultimately is going to inherit the family estate. As this court case is being fought out, it comes out that this is the result of long-standing tensions over the position of Johnny Gar in the family's house and in the family sort of position overall. So Gar's sister Eliza had once asked Elizabeth to change her last name to Jones after the man that Gar's sister claimed was Johnny's biological father. And so she tells Elizabeth here that her husband's father is not who they think he is, and that she should change her last name from Gar to Johnny's real father's last name. Eliza's son admits in court that the reason that his mother had made this request of Elizabeth is that she did not want a native man or his children to bear their family name. The tensions within the Gar family over Johnny are replicated within the larger community. When he dies, one letter to the editor about the accident refers to Johnny as simply, quote, one of our citizens, end quote. It also reported that 21 vehicles loaded with sympathizers accompanied his remains to the cemetery. This particular description is one that supports Johnny as an upstanding man in the community. This is not a man who is reckless. It's not a man who's described as somebody who could never really be part of the community. He is, quote, one of our own. The letter ends with a statement saying that the contents of his wagon at death suggested that, quote, his last thoughts, or nearly so, were of his family's welfare, end quote. Furthermore, this also tells us that there's some support in the community for Johnny. Elizabeth's marriage to a half-native man does not appear to have disqualified Elizabeth from obtaining a form of white respectability. After Johnny's death, she's able to find work as a dairymaid and eventually marries a Swedish convert to the church named John Anderson. Many of her descendants have remained within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Other communities members, however, were reluctant to accept Johnny. According to Johnny's cousin Fielding, Johnny hated being referred to as an Indian and once got into a, quote, fracas, end quote, with a boy who called him one. Another instance was published in the Salt Lake Herald. When he was in a butcher shop in Logan, a man shouted, and this is the story I was referring to earlier, "Get out, you dog," ostensibly at a stray dog who was trying to steal, quote, a leg of mutton on the counter, end quote. According to the newspaper, Johnny thought the man was using the epithet for him and threatened the people in the store with, quote, a large knife, end quote. And as you can imagine, his experiences were particularly difficult because of the Bear River Massacre. Some of his family members and descendants have argued that his death was not actually, quote, an accident. His granddaughter, Opal, has speculated that somebody killed her grandfather because he was Native. She told her niece, who wrote her master's thesis on her family history, that, quote, they was killing the Indians. That's where they killed my grandpa, end quote. Others believed that they knew which of their neighbors had been responsible for his death, but had decided to remain quiet. Opal saw her grandfather's death not as an accident, but really as a kind of lynching in which they were getting rid of the Native man in their community. The Gar case and Johnny's tenuous position among the saints raised important questions about the relationship between white Mormons and Native Americans. For a long time, the gospel had been sort of focused on the redemption of Native Americans, but Johnny's case for the people in the community raised the questions, should the restored gospel be a faith focused on the redemption of Native peoples or not? What should the role of Native people be among the Latter-day Saints? And ultimately, should these relationships that some white Latter-day Saints had formed with Native people be considered legitimate? Behind that last question lay another. Throughout the 19th century, we'll try to stop coughing. Throughout the 19th century, white Latter-day Saints had emphasized the reality of kinship ties that had been created through their rights and through their religious faith. Latter-day Saints had hinted that relationships that were created between people in the temple might have material effects. So many of these sort of native people had been sealed to white families in the temple, and theoretically, these people were part of their eternal families. By this logic, Johnny Gar was Gar's child, regardless of whether or not he was actually biologically his son. Gar's siblings, however, insisted that it was biological reality and nothing else that determined kinship. They rejected the idea that Gar could lay claim to a child and expect him to be accepted as a member of their family. And they sort of argued that Johnny was illegitimate, and therefore there was no way he could be a family member, whether adopted or not. And I'm actually going to skip ahead for a second because we were running out of time. Ultimately, they decided that, here, we'll skip ahead to this one, initially the court finds against Johnny's children and says that he is illegitimate and therefore they have no right to inherit. But the Utah Supreme Court reverses that decision and says that ultimately the reason why the Gar family had been reluctant to accept the legitimacy of Johnny was because he was native. And so they ultimately reverse that decision and give Gar's estate to Johnny's children. In spite of the fact that they ultimately have the case decided in their favor, Johnny's children and his descendants see this fight as sort of their origin story and as a case in which their own family members try to disinherit them. And what's really interesting about the MA thesis that one of his descendants wrote is that she says basically that this is their Mormon origin story. They don't see their sort of beginnings of their family as belonging to upstate New York or Nauvoo, where the Mormons had tried to create a Latter-day Saint kingdom. For her, their origin story is in this court case and in the Cache Valley. And so they have a very different story than many white Latter-day Saints. And so for many sort of these native people, they have sort of seen these sort of wranglings over whether or not they can marry white people, over their status in the community as part of their story as Latter-day Saints. And this is true for the victims of the Bear River Massacre. Very quickly after the Bear River Massacre, many of the Northwestern Shoshone, which is the name of the band that is massacred at Bear River, end up converting to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And they have sort of seen the Bear River as really an important turning point for their people. They don't necessarily see it as a beginning or as an end, but as something that has shaped them. And the former chairman of the Northwestern Band has actually recently reclaimed and bought back the land on which the massacre happened. It had been owned by a local farmer in the area. The massacre happened sort of around Preston, Logan, the border of Idaho and Utah, and they're building a museum commemorating the massacre. And this is a photo of one of the trees that is near the massacre site. And what people do, Latter-day Saints, non-Latter-day Saints, Native people, non-Native people, is they actually come and leave gifts and memorials on the limbs of the trees. One of the ones that Darren finds particularly meaningful that I thought about putting up here is somebody actually left a sort of stereotypical Native American doll in buckskin clothing on a cradle board hanging from one of the trees, but they cut off the head, representing the deaths that had happened at this site. And so the story that I have told you today is a story that is really focused in large part on Utah and the Latter-day Saints. But one thing that I want to say sort of as we come to a close is that I think we could tell similar stories about the histories of Wyoming, Utah, and Montana. White people, white settlers have frequently removed Indian children from their homes, whether that be for boarding schools, whether that be through the foster care system. This is not just a story that is a story that happened in Utah and Idaho. It's a story that happens in Montana, in Wyoming, in Bozeman, that happened in the 19th century and happens in the 20th century. And I want to tell very quickly sort of a story from my own history that relates to this. So my great-grandmother's first husband was a member of the Shoshone Nation. She ended up divorcing him and then married my grandfather, who was a refugee from the Mexican Revolution. She raised her children in Black Rock, Idaho, which is about 5 or 10 miles away from Pocatello, about 20 miles away from the Fort Hall Indian Reservation. She was a former school teacher and a journalist. She wrote for one of Blackfoot's newspapers. She was unable, however, to keep her children from being sent to boarding schools. When I asked my mother about it, she simply said she was forced to send them. Last Christmas, my mother asked me to go through a box of papers that had been lying around the house. My stepfather just died. My mother's only like 65, but is starting to clean out her house in preparation for, I guess, death, but who knows? I mean, I keep telling her she has another 30 years left. Like, this is not the time, but she is determined. One of the things in the box was an old cookie jar with letters and photographs. When I opened it up, most of them were from my great-grandmother's daughter, Laura, my great-aunt, who had been sent to the Riverside Indian School. After she graduated, Laura married a fellow student and lived in California for decades before finally coming home. The letters and pictures documented her longing for her Idaho family and also the joy that she felt in her own children. There are many stories we can tell about our own families, the places where we grew up, and about our nation. One of the things I've long admired about both the Extreme History Project and the Ivan Doig Center is their commitment to ensuring that a wide variety of stories are told and that we never fall into the danger of knowing only a single story about a place. And so I think now I'll open myself up for questions, but one thing that I hope will happen is that when we retreat to the reception, I'd love to hear some of your stories that relate to today's topic. Thank you.